All right, today we're going to be analyzing the geopolitical chessboard, the Red Sea crisis, and the global impacts. The Red Sea crisis represents one of the most consequential disruptions to global trade and security in the early 21st century. Emerging from the intersection of a protracted regional war, great power competition, and the structural vulnerabilities of globalization itself. It is a foundational lies Yemen civil war, which erupted in 2014 when the Houthi movement seized control over large portions of the country, including the capital, and entered into conflict with the intentional, recognized Yemeni government backed by a Saudi led coalition. Over the following decade, the Houthis transformed from localized insurgency into a regional actor with advanced missiles, drone, and naval strike capabilities, which enabled by Iranian support as part of the Tehran's broader strategy of asymmetric pressure against the rivals of Western interests. The Red Sea became a central arena in the strategy because it contains the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the world's most vital maritime checkpoints, through which roughly 12 to 15% of global maritime trade normally passes, linking Europe and Asia to the Middle East via the Suez Canal, beginning in late 2023 and intensifying through 2024 and 25. The Houthis launched a sustained attack on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, using anti-ship missiles and drones and explosive boats, publicly justifying targeting vessels of diverse nationalities. Often with little to no direct connection to Israel, these attacks shattered long-standing assumptions about freedom of navigation and one of the world's most heavily trafficked lanes, forcing major shipping companies to suspend the Red Sea transits and remote vessels thousands of miles around Africa's Cape Cod and Cape of Good Hope. Adding weeks to voyages, dramatically increasing the fuel consumption and straining global logistics networks. The economic consequences rippled outward almost immediately as freight rates surged, war risk insurance premiums multiplied, shipping capacity tightened, and just-time supply chains already weakened as the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and broader geopolitical fragmentation face renowned disruptions by the pandemic. I'm sorry. It faced manufacturing, electronics, retail, and energy disruptions. Europe proved especially vulnerable due to its dependence on the Red Sea corridor of Asian manufactured goods and Middle Eastern energy supplies, while developing countries faced higher food and fuel prices that intensified inflation, worsened the trade imbalance, and heightened the risk of social unrest. In response, the United States and the United Kingdom and the Allies launched multinational maritime security operations and carried out air and missile strikes against the Houthi positions in Yemen, reducing some immediate threats, but failing to fully restore the confidence in the route and raising the risk of wide regional escalation. These responses exposed deeper geopolitical fractures as China and Russia largely refrained from direct military involvement while quietly seeking assurances for their own shipping, reinforcing perceptions that the global maritime security, once treated as a shared public good, is increasingly fragmented along strategic and political lines. Beyond economics and geopolitics, the crisis imposed significant environmental costs as long shipping routes led to subsequently higher carbon emissions at times when the maritime sector forces pressure to decarbonize while the danger of the oil spills wreaks and damage to fragile maritime ecosystems. grew with every attack on civilian vessels. The human dimensions was equally severe with Yemeni I'm sorry again. Greek's damage on fragile maritime ecosystems grew with every attack on civilian vessels. The human dimensions was equally severe with the Yemeni civilians continuing to endure the compound suffering of the war, the economic collapse and the humanitarian deprivation, and civilian seafarers finding themselves on the front lines of the quasi-naval conflict, facing unprecedented risk, trauma, and loss of life. Strategically, the Red Sea crisis exposed the relatively low cost of asymmetric warfare, which can disrupt critical global arteries, challenging traditional nations of deterrence of highlighting how non-state actors can generate global effects without traditional notions of defense and highlighting, I keep repeating myself, without matching the military power of the nation states. As a result, government corruption and insurers have begun reassessing long-held assumptions that efficiency should always trump resilience, accelerating shifts toward route diversification, higher inventories, nearshoring, and friendshoring, all which carry long-term costs implications for global growth for the consumer prices. Diplomatically, the crisis has further complicated efforts to end the Yemen war as external strikes and regional rivalries risk hardening positions and entangling peace negotiations with a broader Middle Eastern conflicts involving Iran, Israel, and the Western powers. Over the long term, the normalization of the attacks on commercial shipping threatens to erode international norms protecting civilian trade and raises possibly I got something in my eye. Raises possibility that similar tactics could that the tactics could be employed in other strategic checkpoints such as the Straits of Hormuz and the Malacca Strait, multiplying global risk. In conclusion, the Red Sea crisis stands as a stark warning about the fragility of the modern global order, demonstrating how instability in a narrow stretch of the water can cascade into worldwide economic disruptions, geopolitical tensions, environmental damage, and human suffering. What began as an extension of the Yemen's internal conflict evolved into a stress test of globalization itself, revealing that the arteries of global trade are both indispensable and dangerously exposed, and underscoring that without sustaining diplomacy, conflict resolution, and renewed commitment to protecting the global commons, similar crises are likely to reoccur and need even greater consequences for an intercontinental or interconnected world. Now, building on these lessons, the Red Sea crisis is also forcing a broader strategic reassessment of how power, vulnerability, and influence are exercised in the modern international system, particularly in spaces that fall outside the clear sovereignty of any single state. Maritime checkpoints like the Red Sea reveal a paradox of globalization. The more the world depends on a narrow set of routes for economic efficiency, the more leverage actors gain by threatening those routes, even without the capacity to control them outright. This reality is likely to shape the future defense planning of foreign policy as states increasingly view the protection of sea lanes, ports, and undersea infrastructure not merely as a naval mission but as an integral component of national economic security. At the same time, the crisis highlights the limits of military solutions alone, as repeated strikes and patrols have struggled to fully neutralize and dispersed resilient adversary embedded in a broader political conflict, reinforcing the agreement that durable stability can only come from addressing the root causes, such as governance failure, regional rivalries, and unresolved wars. The Red Sea crisis has therefore become a reference point in debates about the future of international order, illustrating how non-state actions can exploit gray zones conflict to impose global costs. However, collectively, security can fracture under geopolitical competition, and how civilians' economic systems increasingly serve as battlegrounds in modern warfare. Ultimately, the ongoing repercussions of the crisis suggest that true legacy may not be measured solely by shifting losses or economic statistics, but by how profoundly it reshapes the global attitudes towards risk, cooperation, and the balance between the openness and the security of an era where the world prosperity flows through the handful of vulnerable maritime corridors. Now, as these dynamics continue to unfold, the Red Sea crisis is increasingly understood not as an isolated disruption, but as a symptom of a deeper transition in the global system, where economic interdependence no longer quarantines stability that or guarantees stability and may in fact create new points of coercion. The crisis underscores how globalization has outpaced the political and security frameworks meant to protect it, leaving critical arteries of trade exposed to actors willing to exploit ambiguity, ideology, and asymmetric tactics. This reinforces the idea that the future conflicts may prioritize economic pressures and targets because of the outsized impact on civilian life and global markets. Excuse me. In the sense of the Red Sea, which has become a proving ground for the form of warfare that blurs the boundaries between state and non-state actors, peace and conflict in military and civilian domains. The response to this challenge will likely shape international behavior for years to come, influencing how alliances are structured, how trade routes are secured, and how much risk societies are willing to tolerate to pursue an economic efficiency. Whether the world moves toward greater cooperation to safeguard shared spaces or retreats into fragmented, self-proactive blocks remains uncertain. But the lessons of the Red Sea crisis is unmistakable. Whether the world moves toward greater cooperation to safeguard shared specs or retreats into fragmented, self protective blocks remains uncertain. But the lessons of the Red Sea crisis are unmistakable. In an interconnected world, strategic instability in one region can no longer be contained, and cost of ignoring unresolved conflicts and fragile governance is ultimately paid on a global scale. For the general public, the Red Sea crisis offers a critical reminder that distinct conflicts are not abstract and isolated events, but forces that can directly affect everyday life through higher prices, delayed goods, energy instability, and increased geopolitical tensions. What happens along a narrow stretch of water thousands of miles away can influence the cost of food at the grocery store and the availability of consumer products and the broader economic security of nations, illustrating how deeply interconnected modern societies have become. This crisis also reveals how civilian infrastructure and commerce are increasingly entangled in global power structures, making ordinary workers, consumers, and safers unintended participants in conflict driven by the political and ideological goals. Understanding this reality is essential for informed public discourse as it underscores the importance of diplomacy, conflict prevention, and investments in international institutions that protect shared global spaces rather than allowing them to become arenas of unchecked concern. Moving forward, the path out The path out of the crisis lies not in perpetual escalation, but in a balanced approach that combines credible security measures with sustained diplomatic engagement and long term conflict resolution. Protecting freedom of navigation requires cooperation among nations, reinforcement of international law, and realistic assessments of how the military force can and cannot shape outcomes when deeper political grievances remain unresolved. At the same time, government and industries must prioritize resilience alongside efficiency by diversifying supply chains, strengthening contingency planning, and reducing over resilience on a handful of checkpoints that expose the global economy to disproportionate risk. Ultimately, the Red Sea crisis should be understood as both a warning and an opportunity. A warning that the foundations of global trade and security are more fragile than they appear, and an opportunity to rethink how the world manages shared resources, addressing long running conflicts and balances. Economic integration, lasting security, and prosperity depend on only on military strength, but on diplomacy, cooperation, and a collective commitment to reducing the conditions that allow local conflicts to generate global consequences. And I believe the consequences are what we may be already feeling in some cases. That's just my opinion. But let me know what you guys think about this one. And please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate everything and everyone who has watched me. And till next video, have a good day.